Welcome into this week's episode of Beyond the Forecast. Meteorologist Steve Fendera here. We got the full crew here. Well, 60% of the full crew, right?
Partial,
A good amount.
How's everyone doing today?
Excellent, doing really
It's
well.
going good.
I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to this week's episode because we're going to be going back and talking about history.
We're going
Yeah.
back in time.
Yeah.
And many of us have heard the joke here in our meteorological career. You have a career where you could always be wrong and still have a job.
Yeah,
How many
right.
times have you guys heard that
50%
joke?
of the time you get the forecast right.
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. And I remember that always grinding my gears in undergraduate. And, oh, well, you picked a career where, if you're wrong, that's okay. Like, you could still have a job, yada,
Right.
yada, yada. It's like, well,
It's not totally true.
it's not totally true.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
No.
there are people that do rely on this stuff.
Of course.
For their everyday life. Yeah.
Yes, they do. For their business, for their personal well-being, and when we go back in time, it can be a big factor if a forecast is correct or incorrect.
When you're
Yeah.
talking about one of the biggest military operations in recent history. We, right now, we're recording this on June 4th, and 2 days, June 6th, the anniversary, 81-year anniversary of D-Day, which was when the Allied forces moved into Western Europe to liberate the European continent from Nazi Germany. And it was a huge turning point in World War II. If anyone is not familiar with the June 6th date, it's one that we honor almost every year. I mean, we're a big military community, so I have talked to 99 and 100-year-old World War II veterans, that had a connection somewhere in there to the D-Day invasion. And super, super impactful in terms of history, but also what very fascinating to us here as meteorologists is that weather played such a massive, massive role in this operation and in this invasion, so to speak, to liberate and secure the free world. I mean, to kind of put an end to what was going on across the European continent in World War II, to kind of mark the beginning of the end. And its success here of D-Day was heavily reliant on the weather. It would have looked totally different if they got the forecast wrong.
Yeah, and at a time, too, where, think back to that time when we didn't have the knowledge about weather that we do nowadays. So think
Right.
about how hard it was back then to come up with a forecast that could literally mean the success or failure of a mission.
And we're talking big, and I mean, this was a huge success, but
Yeah.
the forecast wasn't totally right here. And that's what's also super fascinating, as Brian mentioned. We have all these tools and forecasting models and how do we predict stuff, and we have the tech to do that.
You didn't have that back then.
81 years ago, you didn't have that.
Yeah.
No.
So how do you forecast?
Yeah,
That's the challenge. Where do you get your data from? The amount of data that we get in improves the forecasts as we output that. So amount in can equal a better quality product going out.
Yeah.
But
We had bare bones back then. Like,
Yeah.
it was simple, like temperature, maybe
Pressure.
humidity, pressure. Like, that's
and
really
wind speed,
all we
and
had.
that's it.
Like, nowadays, we could look at a satellite image. We
Yes,
could see
they didn't
everything
have
going
that
on from
stuff.
above. They didn't have
It was
any of that.
It was as simple as
Yes.
looking out the window, and from an operational standpoint, in terms of a military operation, the environment is the uncontrollable. I mean, you can control the amount of soldiers going this direction, the amount of aircraft going that direction, but what you can't control is the environment. So that was the first thing, and nowadays still is the first thing that is briefed when big decisions need to be made. What is the uncontrollable going to be? What's the weather going to be?
Yeah.
So in this episode of Beyond the Forecast, we are going to go back and tell you the story of that forecast leading up to the invasion of Europe and the liberation of Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff. And basically, it's just super, super fascinating. We have a 2.5, 3-minute clip that we ran last year on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So we're going to run that, give you a rough overview of what unfolded that, 81 years ago, and then we will come back and we'll chat a little bit about it and go over some more specifics, because there's some really kind of cool little nuggets of history here. So we're going to run this story. We'll be right back after it. The beginning of the end of World War II, Operation Overlord, would have looked a lot different if it weren't for a weather forecast.
It was the path to victory. There wasn't another alternative.
In the planning stages of D-Day, Eisenhower and his staff looked for 3 factors from the environment: low tide at dawn to expose German obstacles, a full moon to provide paratroopers added illumination, and clear and calm weather conditions. This pointed towards an invasion on June 5th.
The weather, the one thing beyond the control of General Eisenhower, had to be known in advance.
Enter Captain James Stagg, Chief Meteorological Advisor for the Allies. He called for stormy conditions on the 5th and urged Eisenhower to hold off for a day. He was optimistic clearing and improving conditions would follow. But back then, there was no satellite imagery or computer model data, so forecasting was heavily dependent on weather observations. Air crews like RAF Squadron 518 would take stripped-down Halifax bomber planes and fly out over the open Atlantic. They'd radio back observations like temperature and air pressure.
The Germans, without air bases in the Atlantic outside of Europe itself, didn't have that advantage.
These crews provided Stagg with enough information to give Eisenhower proper guidance. And as the weather deteriorated on June 4th and 5th, it was vital information the Allies had and the enemy did not.
Rommel, in command of the German defenses, had actually gone home to see his wife. It was her birthday. He supposedly said to one of his officers, "One thing is for certain, there won't be an invasion today. The weather is just too bad."
It wasn't exactly what Eisenhower hoped for. With rough seas in the channel and low clouds early on,
The river was so damn rough, we had to untangle everything before we could get out. We were going to have trouble, and we're getting into something serious.
but as the morning progressed, Stagg's forecast would verify.
Weather looks like it's chancy or it's going to rain that day. We just reschedule, no big deal, we don't think about it. But Eisenhower was talking about an invasion to secure the free world. What was at stake in his weather report was so much higher than anything we're ever going to face.
Steve Fundero, 10 on your side. All right, welcome back here. How's everyone doing? Fascinating history.
It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Fascinating history. Kind of spooky, too, in a way. That, you know, like, now something of that magnitude is, you know, at the hands of a couple people, the decision about what to do and how to move
Huge
forward with
pressure.
it.
Huge. I mean, you have the coordination of all the military, where the boats, where the personnel need to be, where the aircraft need to be, whatever needs to be placed, but then you have to figure out the forecast in a very difficult spot to forecast. I've never lived there in that part of the world, but we're going to get into that later on. And it's a really challenging spot to forecast because the climate is totally different than it is across North America.
For perspective, before we get into the forecast, but for perspective of magnitude here, the amount of troops that were on the ground on the beaches was over 150,000. So about 150,000 boots on the ground. Then you have about 20 to 25,000 paratroopers in the air, around 4,000 landing craft vessels that were used, about 7,000 naval vessels. That includes about 1,200 warships. So you're talking about like 1,200 warships of some capacity, in addition to 1,000 other types of different boats that are going around, and almost 12,000 types of aircraft. So that would be between the paratrooper aircrafts, maybe between the bombers, maybe between the fighter, the fighter planes that were going around. So yeah, talk about magnitude. This is one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history.
And the one thing that I was so surprised at, the paratrooper part of it.
Yes.
Needing the full moon to align with all of these weather conditions to make this happen. The odds of everything coming together the way
in
it
that
did.
regard.
Like, and then executing the mission.
Yeah.
Like that's
Let
just
alone,
like you have the weather. If you have the weather conditions, great.
And they have to
Then
go.
you
and
have
they
to
gotta
go
do it. Yeah, and for another kind of perspective as well. I mean, they plan to have the assault at dawn on June 5th was the original day, but eventually on the 6th they went at dawn to go right around first light sunrise. But the paratroopers and the air support, they went in 3 to 4 hours prior to be. The goal was so they were already on the ground.
Okay.
On the backside, on the flank, and then the assault would then come in. So then there would kind of be more of a surrounding approach to it, more of an element of surprise.
Kinda
so
meet
that's
together.
why the full moon was one of the crucial for the paratroopers in the air, and then the low tide, because just from reconnaissance, they knew that there would be,
Traps.
obstacles,
Yeah.
traps, kind of tank traps and things like that buried, 10, 15 feet below the channel in the sand. So it's like, okay, well, if we have a low tide, that stuff can be exposed and that could be more maneuverable.
And during
in that
a full
regard.
moon, the tides are
Amplified.
compared to a quarter moon, like a
Right.
first quarter, last
Yeah.
quarter moon. So you have more of that gravitational pull on the Earth. It grabs a little bit more water. Same thing for a new moon. So the low tides are lower, the high tides are a little higher. Could only be a few inches,
But it can make a difference.
maybe even
Make
a
a
few
difference.
Totally
foot,
make-
but that's a
yeah.
big difference.
Can make
Totally.
a big difference, yeah. Especially if you're talking about maybe the height difference of one soldier to the next. I mean,
Right.
a lower tide provides maybe a better chance that they're on their feet when they're in the water,
Right.
in a foot of water compared to 4 feet of water.
Because you
or
also
2
have
feet
to
of
think
water.
like the amount of equipment that they're carrying when
Yes.
they're exiting the ships into water. You don't even think
Yeah.
about wave action. Then you have waves going through, and in this high stress environment that
Yep.
these troops were put in,
Mm-hmm.
like all these factors working against them, and then waves coming in. You have machine gun fire. You
Yeah.
have
Yep.
explosions. Like I can't imagine being in a position
in
like
a position like that.
And we've
Yeah.
seen some of the images too, where the troops are on the beach with the tank traps and those obstacles that are in the way.
Yeah, and we've
So-
seen the movies and
Yeah.
the documentaries.
So
and all of that.
let's say the surface of the water is 2 to 3 feet higher, so it's 10 feet farther up the beach. Now
Yeah.
those traps are where the boats need to land,
Exactly.
and
Yep.
you can't land a boat there because
Right.
where the troops need to come off, like we see in this image here, the boat would hit the trap and they would tip over. It would
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So
It'd be
those
chaos.
were the two elements that is like, okay, we can control that scientifically. A full moon and a low tide. Those are you know that. I mean, that is so cyclical
That can be
you know
predicted.
that, right?
Yes.
The third environmental factor that was needed, of course, was good weather. That was where it was out of control. That's where we can't control that. But the reason, it's like, well, why does it matter, good weather in this kind of situation? The low cloud coverage, if there was thick cloud coverage, that would mean air support would basically be zero. Because, you have planes flying in, there's no visibility about where they're going, where they're looking, where they're landing, where their drop zones are all that kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. Clear skies, so those flying the planes, we could see. We would know where we're going. And then calm conditions in the English Channel. This isn't necessarily exposed to the Atlantic, so it is a little bit protected, but the English Channel is very big, and of course it acts as a big, big bay. So rough seas there makes it really difficult for the landing craft, the kind of amphibious landing crafts you could see here in this picture. They're smaller little boats. I mean, they're not rolling ashore on the big destroyers or the big
Right.
battleships. They're
It's
coming
rough.
on those. So calmer waters in that regards makes that transition a little bit sooner or smoother.
Do you take one of those boats and go across the Chesapeake Bay with 15-mile-an-hour winds?
Yeah.
The side that you come from, where the winds are offshore, it's smooth. By the time you get just a few hundred yards off the shore, it's
Yeah.
already starting to get
Chopped
bumpy
up.
and
Starting to get
chopped up.
choppy. Yeah. So that's exactly why. Okay, those were the three things we were looking for. Okay, now let's try to forecast that. Nowadays, that's easy, right? We just look at computer
Kind of.
models and think, okay, like what's
Well,
going on? Yeah,
Still
Yeah.
tough.
still tough. But
Yep.
nowadays, it's okay. There's a lot more of that information readily available. So, Captain James Stagg, he was the chief meteorological advisor to Eisenhower, who was commander in chief about all of this. And the window of the low tide and the full moon was June 5th, 6th, and 7th. Okay, there's a 3-day window
A 3-day window.
of the prime conditions for the low tide and the full moon.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the weather in that situation? Eisenhower said, we got to get this done. They kind of were losing patience, so with urgency said, all right, let's go for June 5th. However, enter the Captain James Stagg, who was the meteorological advisor. Talk about being a chief meteorologist, Jeff.
Yep.
I mean, this is like top notch.
This is intense because you're talking to Eisenhower.
You're talking to Eisenhower, and you're saying,
Yes.
"Hey, hang on a second. Let's not go on the 5th. Push it back a day." And there was some back and forth about it because there was a loss. There was, Eisenhower was losing patience. We got to get this done. We're losing the element of surprise. And sure enough, convinced Eisenhower to push it back of a day because he had seen a clearing, or at least was optimistic at better weather coming in on the 6th. So the rough synoptic scenario kind of where there was two fronts, two weak areas of low pressure coming in. You can see on the right side of your screen there, London and Normandy Beach, kind of that northern coast of France. That's where the bulk of the invasion was. That right there, that little sliver, that's the English Channel. And there was a front coming in right over top of the channel right around June 4th and 5th. But there was a little window behind the cold front that suggested that there might be better weather. You kind of see it here. There might be a little bit of better weather, maybe a slight uptick in pressure, maybe a little bit of high pressure sliding in that would provide for some better conditions. But
so the basics here that we're looking at on the map, areas of low pressure, the wind is going to be strongest around that. It's also going to be strongest when you have a front passing by. So the wind would generally be out of a southerly direction ahead of the front, out of a northerly direction behind the front. See the arrows on the low there? So two areas of low pressure, even though we don't see the H, the high pressure, even we don't have that on the map, in between those areas, there's a lack of low pressure, which is thus high pressure.
Yeah. Which is thus high pressure. Yeah,
Yes.
and that's exactly what Stagg had noticed in the weather observations that were coming in from the west. He noticed there was a slight increase in air pressure 600 miles north or so of Ireland. So kind of, way up here, he noticed, okay, there was maybe an uptick in pressure. And that's exactly what you were just alluding to. Two areas of low pressure. In between, there's going to be a little bit of an uptick. So that hinted to him that there might just be a little bit better weather. And knowing that this operation had to go and there was a sense of urgency, and you had basically 3 days to choose from, it's like, well, why not just choose the day that has the better chance at being better?
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of maybe the thinking that then went along with it.
Give yourself the best odds.
Give yourself the best
There's
odds.
a lot of lives at stake in that forecast.
You're talking about...
It's not just a couple gardeners or people going shopping or a picnic. It's lives.
Yes, or going to the ball game or going to the baseball game, whatever. Like, no, this is the operation to secure the free world. And this was one of the biggest forecasts that I think of
all time.
Of all time, maybe. At
Easily.
least of American history, maybe across the world, at least over the last 100 years. We could put it up there because of the magnitude of the events that unfolded after this event. Now, we talked about this a little bit early on. Forecasting back then, there's no satellite data.
Right.
There's no computer models.
So where do you get your data from?
Where do you get your data from? You look out the window? Right?
Yeah, you have
that's
ships.
Pretty much it.
Other
right?
ships, aircraft.
Right, aircraft, and that's exactly what they did. Now, the forecast that unfolded, or the weather that unfolded, wasn't perfect because, of course, forecasting back then is so difficult. Right. So the front that came in on the 4th and the 5th, we could see it there on the right side of your screen across the English Channel. There were still rough seas in the morning. There were still low clouds in the morning. So if you go back and watch Band of Brothers or any one of those documentaries and you see the paratroopers, so many of them were just scattered and they missed their timing, they missed their drop zones and all that kind of stuff. They didn't know where it was tough. But as the morning progressed, sure enough, there started to be some clearing skies and the sunshine came out, and then the air support was able to really take over. So the forecast did verify, not the best, but it verified, and it better than what it would have been on the 5th. But again, how do you get that info? Jeff alluded to it. It was aircraft. Think back to the hurricane hunters about how we get our information about tropical cyclones. There are pilots that fly planes into the hurricanes, and that's exactly what was going on in 1944.
Right.
With a Royal Air Force squadron. It was called 518. And they basically took down, I like to consider them like the original hurricane.
They're the first.
The first.
Laid the foundation
The OGs.
for future missions.
Yes, of course. And they took, so essentially they were a group of airmen in the Royal Air Force that flew the Handley Page Halifax bombers, a type of plane, but they stripped out all the guns and they weren't lugging bombs and they weren't lugging weaponry. They loaded the planes up with weather equipment, meteorological equipment, and all they would do was fly recon. But they would fly out west because weather moves from west to east. We know that. And that's so much easier to get a forecast back then in the 40s and the 30s in the United States because we have weather observations in Pittsburgh, in Chicago, in Minneapolis, coming from west to east. So you can see that weather coming in and you could make a forecast based on that. What's to the west of Europe?
A lot of ocean.
A whole lot of ocean. A whole lot of ocean.
A safe area
there.
to get information from, too.
Yeah.
If the weather came from the opposite direction, or let's say the landmass was flipped, and we had to attack going west, you'd be flying blind.
Yeah.
And still in this forecast, I know we don't have computer models that are running, but when you just look at the general map, so you look at the left side of the map, you can fly anywhere in that area and you're safe to get data.
Yes.
But if you fly to the right half, especially over land where it's under Nazi control, you can't be flying
Yes.
there. So no data. So
No
you
data.
still have a hole in the data, even though the weather always doesn't come from that area. You still, okay, well, there's some warm air coming from there. Is there anything that's stalled down there? You don't know.
Yeah.
So there's a hole in the data, and that's a challenging part of the forecast
Right.
as well.
But also at the same time, this provided an advantage for the Allies because Nazi Germany did not have air superiority or air control over the Atlantic. They had a few U-boats out there, and that was, of course, that would be an issue as well. But the amount of air superiority came from the Allies over the Atlantic. So
Yes, it did.
was a little bit easier to have ships that go out there to collect weather data. But most of it came from the RAF Squadron 518 is what is the group of the airmen. And they flew from the small island of Tiree in Scotland. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny island off the western coast of Scotland right here. And they would just do a couple 100-mile trips out in the Atlantic, go west, come back, go west, come back. And they would then they would collect the weather data. They would go right, and most of it was temperature, humidity, pressure. I thought it was interesting. How would they collect wind velocity data when they're flying? Because that would be
Well-
something. They would collect wind velocity, and then also they would radio back the type of weather they were seeing.
Yeah,
and that's
on-
another thing. They would fly all the time.
On newer aircraft, the aircraft will tell you that. I'm not too specific with the older aircraft, so I don't want to just start guessing
Exactly,
right now.
yeah.
But you can. There should have been a way where you can kind of have a vector in a way where you're where you're fighting the aircraft a bit and figure out the ground speed versus the airspeed.
Yeah.
That should help you.
That should help you. And
that
that
was
was
the math.
And these planes were crewed roughly, I think, with 7, 8 people. But again, they weren't.
They're larger aircraft.
They were larger aircrafts. They weren't ones. I got a picture of the aircraft, I believe.
Okay.
Right here. There it is. That's the Page Halifax bomber, and this picture might be when it's in for the combat or the military or the combat or the assault bombing missions. I
Yes,
guess you would
a
say.
different purpose.
Yeah,
The
different
purpose
purpose.
differently.
They kind of ripped out all that stuff. So you had crew in there, but they weren't manning the guns at the turrets. They were navigating. They were collecting the weather data. They were, I don't know, were they, doing the classic, like, stick your finger out the window and where's the wind blowing from?
Right.
But it did require incredible navigational skills because I think, thinking of the instruments in Hurricane Hunter compared to now, or excuse me, Hurricane Hunter now compared to the instruments then, you have a lot of that computer info that's keeping a consistent pressure. Like, hey, we're flying. It's noting the pressure while you're recording temperature and humidity. It's interesting to know because I did do a little bit of reading and digging that they had to maintain a certain height.
Right.
So then they would have consistent weather observation.
What height was
Right.
that?
I'm not sure the specific height, but nowadays the Hurricane Hunter, it would say what altitude you're at, what
Yeah.
that height.
Do we have
So-
any reason to believe that it was at a lower height, a few thousand feet versus?
Yeah, because they would want to know what the weather would be at the surface,
That's
right?
what I would. That's
They're
what I would
not.
believe.
They're not going to want to go up and what are the upper levels doing? No, they're going to
Doesn't
want to
matter
know
as
what's going
much.
down at the ground.
Right.
I mean, upper levels matter in terms of trying to figure out chance for severe weather and
Yeah,
stuff like
but
that.
no, they just
But you
want to know.
If you want to find where a front is, you need to go closer to the surface.
Yeah.
Because that's where it matters. You don't finding the front upper levels, that doesn't matter as much. You need to find the surface front, and that's probably what they're doing. So I would say
Low,
low.
a couple hundred feet maybe.
Yeah.
Could be.
Could be,
I mean, if you're flying over the water, at least you don't have anything that's sticking out of the ocean that's gonna you
yeah,
can hit.
a couple German U-boats, and they would
Well,
also would do a little
yeah.
bit of recon on that. They would also kind
course.
of course, when you're out there, you would do other types of recon aside from just weather.
If you fly a little bit higher too, you do have better fuel economy. So I don't know what the calculation was for that. I would assume that they probably stripped out the aircraft to be pretty light.
Yeah, they have
Yeah.
to.
Not
Oh, they
carrying a
would
bunch of
have
extra
to.
stuff because they
Yeah.
can get farther flights,
Yeah.
longer flights, more data. They probably had a method with using just probably the stars, navigation to create some type of rough grid.
Yeah.
So the meteorologists could figure out how to plot a front and how to create a surface map.
Map out of that.
To map it because
Yeah.
you can't have 10 data points within 10 miles of the beach.
Right.
And then everyone gets distracted. You start telling stories on the plane, then you don't get another data point for 100 miles.
Yeah.
Then where's the front going to be? I don't know. It could be anywhere in between those 2 points.
Yeah.
So they probably did some type of method with gridding it, I would guess.
I would think so. I mean, this thing could fly upwards of 250 miles an hour, maybe a little bit more. That's considering, though, it has a payload, or it's carrying, it could carry 13,000 pounds.
I don't
which
think
is
it
a
probably
lot,
carried
and
anything.
It probably didn't. It wasn't carrying anything. You know what I mean? So it was just
Yeah.
the weather. It wasn't carrying turrets. It wasn't carrying ammo. It wasn't carrying bombs. No, it was just
No.
you know, a couple of barometers and some wind vanes and
Some
stuff like
life
that.
vests just
some
in
life
case.
vests and things like that. So that means that there was a range of 1,800 to 2,000 miles.
That's
so
huge.
they could have. That's huge. So I mean, these flights did run 8 to 10 hours. So I mean, they could have gone 1,000 miles out and then 1,000 miles back. I mean, we know that Stag knew that there was a uptick in pressure 600 miles north of Ireland. That's pretty far north of where they're flying out of. So they may have gone 1,000 miles northwest and turned around and came back and stuff like that. So it was a rather large plane, so it was able to go far, 100-foot wingspan.
Huge.
Which is large. So I'm comparing that to the C-130 that we have seen. The
Yeah, for
Hurricane
a
Hunters, we have
typical
been in
Hurricane
them.
Hunter nowadays,
We have
yeah.
seen them. Those are the big cargo planes, way more versatile than the smaller, plane back in the 40s, 80 years ago. If you're just talking about differences in advancing in technology here, but that had a wingspan of 130 feet, a length of about 100 feet. These planes were just 100-foot wingspan, 70 feet long.
But you also have to
tip
think,
tail.
prior to this invasion of Normandy, they didn't create these planes for this purpose.
True.
They built them for fighting.
Yeah.
So you have to also factor that in. Like when they were figuring out, okay, weather is going to be a key player here, they didn't have time to go build all new airplanes and do all kinds of research as to what kind of machinery we need for this. They just took what they had.
Yeah.
They gutted those planes of
And
all
then-
the weaponry and put in all the scientific material.
And did the best they could with it.
Yeah.
I mean, when the Hurricaners go out, we have live information of that. That stuff sending back, like live feed.
Automatically.
These crews would radio back the weather info every about 30 minutes. So we would think that they would probably, like you said, Jeff, they probably would get a grid or they would hit a mile mark or something, collect what they've gotten, and then radio that back and then do it at the next checkpoint 30 minutes later.
Yep. Do we know how many aircraft there were in the fleet?
I don't know how many there were in the fleet, but
Because this is my kind of ultimate question. So you're in the room talking to the leaders that are trying to organize where these personnel need to go. I'm not talking about D-Day. I'm just talking about before then.
Right,
So
sure.
let's say I'm the meteorologist and you're a general, and I say I want 5 more aircraft to forecast the weather, and you're going to say, no way.
That's taking away from our mission.
Right. So this is a big conversation that
Huge.
happened probably multiple times, and probably some screaming matches over it too.
going back
In a
and forth.
time period where we knew the bare bones about weather and how
Yeah.
it could relate to these missions. Nowadays, I'm sure weather has a higher importance when it comes to
it's
missions like
probably
this
the
because we
first
know.
thing that they brief.
Yeah, because we know more now. But back then, like those generals who were in charge of the armies and moving different pieces of the puzzle into Europe, like they needed everything that they possibly could have to make this a success. So what, like in their minds, they're probably thinking, we need 5 planes for weather. Like
Yeah.
why would we need that?
It was more than that because they did lose
Right.
about, I think it was 10, could have been a dozen.
Yeah.
I'm not sure on the exact number.
Yeah,
but
you
they
have
lost
close to
about
a dozen written down
close
here.
to a dozen planes and a lot. And what is even more impressive is that they were doing this every day.
Yeah.
They flew every day, no matter the weather, night missions, stormy conditions. They
Had
flew.
to.
In 1944,
Pretty
they
much
flew
every day for a year.
363 days out of 365. Every day but 2 because there was a snow ice event that iced the runway.
Right.
And they tried one takeoff and the plane almost slipped off the runway. So they're like, all right, we can't take off.
And so let's say it's a day where we have kind of a lot of wind, we get some thunderstorms, and then we have to take off to do a flight. Okay, well, it's raining here. It's probably raining everywhere, someone might say.
Yeah,
well,
right.
no, let's go see where that area of clear, dry air is.
Yep.
And maybe they found that on certain flights. Maybe they found that it didn't clear out and it was a stalled area of low pressure that just sat over that part of the world, which can happen in that part of the world. And we have a couple maps that we'll get into later on here, but it's a fascinating situation to think, hey, if we lost 10 to 12 planes, let's say I need 60 planes to fly to do this forecasting. I mean, look at this right here. They got to
these are
maintain
the
these
crews that were
things.
going in. They got to maintain those things that come back, that sometimes come back. That's a 4-engine plane, prop engine
Right.
plane. Sometimes they came back with only 2 engines running.
Right, you lost 50%.
Lost an engine, lost 2 engines, So these things were flying all the time.
I mean, you can
and
lose 1, you can lose 2 engines, but if you lose 3, now you're in big trouble.
Now you're in big trouble.
And I see you had, there were some crew members that passed away too.
Yeah, about 50 to 54 crew members had passed away with this, and again, these weren't the guys, the airmen, the soldiers making the front page of the headlines. You know what I mean? They were doing the behind the scenes, behind the scenes. I mean, like this was behind the scenes, where they're getting the weather data and they're making a surface analysis and a surface map. But then there's info coming in behind that scene. There's stuff going on behind that. So talk about drawing isobars.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry, go ahead.
It also just kind of goes to show that, even whether you are on the front lines or behind the scenes, like you mentioned, doing, gathering weather data, this whole operation surrounding, World War II, just danger everywhere.
Yeah.
And you have to give so much credit to the people who fought and the people who, gave their lives to these missions, because the world would be a much different place without it.
It would be a much, much different place here. And we're so used to looking at surface maps. I mean, can we kind of interpret, I think I see Europe on the left side of her map.
Yeah,
my head around.
I'm seeing that, but I'm also looking at the sheets, the pieces of paper that she's holding onto. So
There
you
you
can
go.
see the one
Yeah.
next to her elbow on the side of the screen because it's more contrast. It's easier to
Is
read.
that all
Yeah.
data they have written down? Maybe?
Yeah, it looks
be,
like
yeah.
it's data that's written down that was transmitted to someone and they compiled it.
Yeah.
And it's probably going by location or height in the atmosphere.
Yep.
It's all gridded out. So there is an organizational method.
So that might be, if they're radioing back this info every 30 minutes, that might be that stuff that comes in. Time code 1.
Yeah.
This was pressure,
Yep.
temperature, humidity, wind at a constant pressure. That's probably, or at a constant height. That's probably the one thing that they knew they could control with these flights, was that we need to stay at a certain height to be able to consistently record. So that also requires incredible types of navigation, because this is not just, hey, we're getting some turbulence, let's go up and above it. No, you got to stay where you're at a certain height so that you can collect, at least have some sort of consistency.
Yeah.
So that when this info gets plotted, they could look, they could look at the surface map and say, like, at 500 feet, this is what the weather is looking like from west to east, from east to north, north to south, kind of deal.
So my opinion on this is that you're given the data sheet of all the readings, all the data. Now you set it down, you have a big map in front of you. This is how I would probably do it. You have a big map in front of you, you know the general locations of where this data came from. You got to plot out everything. So you plot out all the temperatures, wind, humidity. You have it all on a map. So you have the map showing the outline of the country or the island or whatever it is, and then you have all the data. So that from there, I would say now you draw your fronts and now you figure out where your storm systems are.
Yeah,
And-
fronts afterwards. for
Fronts
sure.
afterwards.
Fronts, yeah.
100%. And
Yeah.
this, I mean, now that you said that out loud, they were totally going at a consistent height because they're drawing isobars.
Yeah.
They would want to draw isobars
Right.
to
see
be
the
able to
lines.
draw fronts, and we could see the lines there. So
Yes.
that's the one thing they can control. I mean, you can't fly at a constant pressure because that means you're constantly changing your height when you're in the aircraft.
Right. No, have to keep.
You have to keep a level height. So that's
Yep.
definitely so whether that was
Pilots can do that just fine.
yeah,
They know how to do that. Yeah.
so the navigation of these flights, but that would be it, right? You would get temperature, you would get humidity, you would get all that kind of stuff. Okay, let's map it out and then draw the fronts from there.
I would say that the pilots would have to use previous data to adjust their altimeter on the aircraft, because as you're flying the aircraft, unless you know the exact height you are from the ground, the
Yeah.
instrument panel is going to change based on the air pressure outside, surface pressure. So that does need to be tweaked a little bit
Yeah.
to make sure you're at the right height. It's not changing super dramatic, so that error probably wasn't that significant. Again, they also had barometers on board, so they were able to get that data as well. But I would say you're probably closer to the surface on these flights than high up. I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, but
Yeah.
I would agree more. That also would explain the difficulty in the flights, the loss of aircraft, especially considering they're flying in all sorts of weather.
Yeah.
That would kind of explain that here. So weather just playing a massive role in the invasion of Normandy, the eventual liberation of Europe. That was the success of this operation due to weather, due to surprise, and then of course the coordination of the 150,000+ troops on the ground, 20 to 25,000 aircraft, paratroopers, all that kind of stuff across land, sea, and air forces. Coming up after the break, we're going to take a quick breather. I want to talk a little bit more about the surprise element and how weather played a huge role kind of in that. So there's some really cool kind of tidbits of history here. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back here. Again, discussing the forecast to Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, which I'm known as the beginning of the end of World War II, because it took about 2 months of fighting before Normandy was secured, culminating in the liberation of Paris by August 25th in 1944. I mean, this marked pretty much the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, when Allied forces eventually took victory in Europe in May of 1945 here. So you're almost talking about, what's that, 10 months? No, that's 11 months after, you know. So D-Day remains one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history, turning point in World War II. The term D-Day means the day in which a military operation began. So there's no kind of significant name of why they chose D-Day, but I think it's just kind of in history now. And one of the main reasons it was so successful was weather information and an element of surprise. And that was the big thing they were going for. There were some deception operations. There were some distractions that the Allies were using and kind of sending out, maybe it was messaging or coding and trying to kind of convince the enemy that they were going one way instead of the other way.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest elements of surprise, I think, came from the weather aspect. So we talked about Allied forces having air superiority over the Atlantic, so be able to collect weather information on the Western Front. Nazi Germany had air superiority over the European continent with a few U-boats out in the Channel or out in the Atlantic, so not as much weather data to the west, weather moving west to east. So the enemy forces looked at the forecast and they said, okay, there's stormy weather coming in the next couple of days. Saw the front coming in, said, okay, there's bad weather coming in. We know that. They're probably not going to do anything big with bad weather coming in because we know they need better weather for air support and all that kind of stuff. They're not going to do anything if it's raining or stormy. However, they did not have enough information to know that there was a little bit of clearing that would unfold on June 6th. And the Allies did. So the Allies did know the weather was going to be bad June 5, 6, 7, 8, but the Allies also knew, hey, there was a window on June 6th, a little bit of a window that the weather might be better.
Because they had that data from that part of the atmosphere, that part of the world.
So having that advantage acted as a huge element of surprise, just the extra nugget of information, so much so that Rommel, who was in command of the enemy forces, known as the Desert Fox, I believe was his nickname, he decided to surprise his wife for his wife's 50th birthday.
Okay.
You know when her birthday was?
No.
June 6th.
June 6th.
Her 50th birthday was June 6th. And he was, I'm going to surprise my wife, get her this nice pair of gray suede shoes, and I'm going to take leave. I don't know how many days he took leave for, but he went back home to Germany to surprise his wife for his birthday, to give her a nice pair of gray suede shoes. So the commander-in-chief of the enemy wasn't even present, wasn't even physically present.
He stepped away.
When he stepped away, when the Allied forces moved in. Because he started seeing the weather deteriorate on June 4th and June 5th, and they're not invading.
Right.
We know the weather's going to be bad over the next couple days. Perfect. I'm going to go surprise my wife, go wish her a happy birthday. Gets home to Germany to see his wife on June 6th. Sure enough, here come the Allied forces. And that's when that unfolds. So there was just that extra nugget of, you talk about a surprise that caught the German forces, Nazi forces off guards, just not being here. That's like us not being here when severe weather unfolds.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got to get back, So just a nugget of info there that was just like, oh my gosh.
A little bit of luck thrown there.
A little bit of luck thrown in there as well
forces.
for that. Did intelligence know that Rommel's wife's birthday was June 6th?
I'm wondering that.
I'm wondering that as well.
Yeah, big question.
Did they know that? I don't know.
And I wonder
or was
if,
that just a coincidence?
I wonder if the Nazi forces even, I wonder how they took that. As a, hey, they're doing this invasion. Why aren't you there?
Where's the boss?
I'm curious as to what their standpoint on what was on it too.
Yeah. And maybe
Yeah.
there was the deception aspect of it, and maybe they were
course.
saying, okay, I think our intelligence is telling us that their invasion may be towards, I don't know, next week or a different location and all that
Yep.
kind of stuff. Yeah.
And how would it have changed if his wife didn't have a birthday then and he was
there,
present?
and he
how
changed
would
up-
it have changed their defense?
Right. That's where the luck comes in.
That's
big
Yeah.
time.
kind of going back and wondering the what ifs, in that kind of situation.
Because I don't want to make him sound like a great guy, but if he was a strong leader, maybe he would have helped to organize their situation. I don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
who
I don't know too
knows?
much
Maybe
about
he
it.
hadn't seen his wife in 11 months. And he
Right.
said, you know what? This is my opportunity. Weather's going to be bad. They're not invading.
But it's all these
anytime
little
soon
pieces that come
end up coming
together, that make something like this
Incredible.
happen.
successful,
Yeah.
just
Yep,
successful.
incredible.
So there's a little kind of a old wise tale, I think, or a myth or something. It's like, there was an old gray pair of gray
didn't know
suede
that.
shoes that saved the D-Day invasion or something like that.
Yeah.
So it really just goes back to having the intel about the weather forecast and knowing that there was going to be a little bit of clearing. But talk about the pressure in that forecast. If you're Captain James Stagg, again, he was the meteorological advisor. He was the chief meteorologist to Eisenhower, the advisor, that he was basically giving him the weather info, but also helping him make his decisions. What was the most pressure you've been under, Brian? What's the most pressure you've been under in a forecast?
Ooh, probably this past fall, I was in Savannah before coming here, and we had Hurricane Helene.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest storm of my career so far.
Yeah.
I think peak wind gusts in our area that I was forecasting for hit 100 miles an hour.
Jeez.
We had widespread damage. I lost power for 4 days.
Wow.
That was kind of, for people in coastal Georgia, it was a big one.
Yeah.
Even more so for North Carolina, Western North Carolina. But that was probably the biggest pressure that I felt, just because people wanted to know, how bad.
Yeah.
How bad? What's the timing
Yeah.
the worst of the weather?
Yeah.
But certainly nothing that they had to experience for the Normandy invasion.
Of course, yeah.
Nothing close.
Yeah. Jeff, what about you?
I would say anytime we have a hurricane that's coming through our area here, winter storms, not so much of pressure. There's a lot of pressure in terms of the totals, but
Right.
it's not as people just know, okay, it's going to start snowing here. We
Yeah.
can hunker down. But when it comes to any large scale hurricane or strong hurricane that's going to impact us in Hampton Roads, the pressure is high because there's a lot of things I have to coordinate. Of course, the viewers, they want to know when's it going to hit my house? What kind of impacts we're going to see in my neighborhood? Am I going to lose my roof or damage or flood out, whatever? And then also with the newsroom, making sure our reporters are in the right spots where they need to be, in a safe spot and an effective spot to
Right.
help tell the story of the weather system that's moving through the area. So there's a lot of things that are coordinating because people's jobs, and I want to make sure that our reporters are staying safe.
Yeah.
I don't want anyone trying to be getting in the spot where they're going to get flooded or surrounded.
Or
and-
by lightning or whatever.
yeah, danger. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a couple of years ago when Andy Fox was out on a storm. A power line came down right where they were, and they were near flooded water. The power line went into the pond
Yeah.
and could have been electrocuted. So there's a lot of factors
Yeah.
that we have to make sure we keep people safe. Our viewers, for you, and also for just the people that work here at Wavy. It's a really tough deal. So that's why I rely on you guys when we have these big
course.
storms
Yeah.
to try and kind of help me and help figure it out, because I'm going to the managers trying to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing.
And that's the aspect I think that adds pressure, is that you're saying you're going to the managers, you're going to those who are making decisions. When we're talking about the basic weather forecast, I always try to remind myself of this when we're giving the forecast to the viewers. I can't make decisions for you. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. Granted, if it's severe weather, that's obvious here. But I am providing you the information. I'm giving you the time of when it's going to rain, how much it's going to rain. That is the information. What you do with that, you live your life. You know what I mean? You make your decisions based on that.
Exactly.
But when you start pulling in the decision-making factor into that, that's when the pressure starts to rise. Friends asking me, is it going to rain on my wedding? Should I move it inside or outside? And you just have to tell them you're going to have to move it inside. Making that decision for people, that's when it starts to add a little bit of pressure, other than just saying, here's when it's going to rain. Here's how much it's going to rain. Here's how, the weather setup will be. Here's the information you need. So I think it adds an extra element to the magnitude of a forecast like that when you start to pull in making a decision out of it. You know what I mean? Because that's what, at the end of the day, this was going on, was that the Stagg was forecasting, but he was also advising Eisenhower and saying, hey, don't do it on the 5th, do it on the 6th. Instead of just saying, hey, it's going to be bad weather on the 5th, it might be better on the 6th. Okay, that's your info. Eisenhower could have been like, okay, we'll do it on the 5th anyway. It's like, no, he was really part of that decision, I think that's where it really adds in the pressure.
And this is where the forecasting difficulty comes from. So if you pull up that map that shows kind of the northern hemisphere, this is looking ahead. This is just a random example of the next couple of days ahead for the weather. So don't worry about what it's exactly showing, but we're trying to show kind of what storm systems look like.
Put it in motion there. So I think it's loading. Here you go.
Yeah, you want to, okay, it's loading up. Just pop it up when you get it. So when we have storm systems that move across North America, they may develop in the Rockies, they may develop they may develop over Florida, come up the coastline. Regardless, they can explode or get much larger in size when they move through Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, or towards Greenland or Iceland. So we can see that on the map. And then as those storm systems travel to Europe, now you're tapping into, see, there's one right there.
Yep,
now you're tapping into that colder air coming in out of Canada. So this is data from when we're recording this going 5 days out in the future. So we're basically matching the typical climate of June. So we know that there's still snow happening in these northern areas. You can still have cold rain south of that.
Look at all the rain coming into the European continent right here. You know, you're talking about lows coming in. Here's rainy, foggy weather. Here's stalled weather. I mean, that's kind of the weather that is of London and is of the UK. It's gloomy. It's kind of like San Francisco, Pacific Northwest.
There's more of a persistent trough or low pressure nearby versus that we would have near the central Atlantic where there'd be a persistent high pressure. So you have a ridge going towards Greenland, high pressure. You have a trough, an area of low pressure. You can see how the rain follows that downward valley slope going from all those countries, from France all the way through Europe and then back up towards Russia. It starts to ridge back out. So it's just kind of this is a perfect example. When I thought of this earlier, I was like, I got to just show a map of what the next 5 days looks like. Nothing to do with D-Day, but it shows you why this area is difficult to forecast.
And that's better than winter.
Right.
You know, that's better than winter. May have been also, they pulled that into factor. You know, is the climate better in the June summer season, relatively, you know, a little bit better, not as active. You know, would it have been different if they pushed it to August or September, peak hurricane season? Would there be leftover tropical storms headed up that way, like, you know, looping back up around the Atlantic? That's also another thing. If they waited and delayed it to the next full moon cycle, the next low tide cycle, that would be 2 weeks after the 5th, 6th, or 7th. There was another storm system that moved in that was even bigger and would have been even more of a disaster. So it really was just, you got to do it on the 6th, or who knows? Because then if they saw that forecast coming, they're like, all right, well, we can't do it then. Then who knows?
And I know we kept mentioning that, you know, they didn't have all the tools of forecast. Well, they still had historical data, and that went back easily 30, 40, 50 years in these areas. So they still had
something
good
to
data.
with.
And they had people that lived there their whole lives saying, yeah, we get this kind of weather, but it does clear out. So they even had a little bit of local knowledge, which was huge too. And even though it's across the English Channel, it's still local enough.
And those pilots and those airmen flying those planes out over the Atlantic, just incredible stuff here.
Any final thoughts?
Any final thoughts here? Just a cool nugget, a little history. Think of this the next time we're talking about hurricanes and we mention the hurricane hunters and we mention collecting data to forecast a storm. Just think back to this situation and this point in history and how different it could have been if they got the forecast wrong or they didn't have that weather data. It all starts with the uncontrollable, the environment. That's kind of where it all starts.
And the future, the future of meteorology, I feel like was heavily, dictated by the outcome of D-Day.
Sure.
This whole operation led to very likely some real advancements in the science later on when it comes to technology, but also weather forecasting and data collection and how to transport that information to a people to make decisions. And it's insane. It's crazy to kind of see how it linked up here to the success of the operation. And then you can kind of just see the trickle-down effects where now we have the hurricane hunters. It started with these stripped-down planes. Now the planes are packed with technology.
Up with info, and it's real-time data and all that kind of stuff.
And they're drones, no pilot.
Exactly.
And all that kind of stuff. So you just talk about there's a little bit of rain in the forecast. Maybe I'll reschedule that trip to Busch Gardens because there's a little bit of rain in the forecast. You're not talking about an invasion over 150,000 people, one of the biggest amphibious military assaults in history here. So just super, super impactful. I think we're running out of time here.
We're out of time.
We're out of time. All right. That is this week's episode of Beyond the Forecast. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I know it's kind of just kind of sit and listen to Steve spew some history.
Great research
But,
on this.
Great
research.
really
This is
cool
cool.
stuff, really fascinating here. It's a big military town here, so of course, pay your respects to any veterans and military personnel out there. And we'll catch you guys next week. I think next week we're doing a little sports and weather. Should be fun.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
I think
that's
I
next
got
week.
that
Yeah,
right.
that's
I think
right.
Next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should be some cool
Some
stuff
fun
here.
stuff.
All right, folks. Thanks for hanging out with us. This was the latest episode of Beyond the Forecast.